remark, right?
Ladies and gentlemen, we're pleased to be joined today by Lieutenant General Townsend, coming to us live from Baghdad. He's the commander of the Joint Task Force Operation Inherent Resolve. Sir, we'll turn it over to you for your opening remarks and then take questions from here.
Okay. Thanks, Jeff. Good morning, everybody, from Baghdad, and happy holidays. Since we're nearing the end of the year, I thought it was appropriate to review the progress mass terrorists in long columns of vehicles, all flying the black banner of ISIL. It's organized and built or rebuilt their forces and began to counterattack. In 2016, our campaign is all about the counteroffensive, liberating terrain and the population in Iraq and Syria from the clutches of ISIL's brutal control. ISIL is a tyrannical terrorist group bent on destroying our way of life and imposing their own twisted ideology, plain and simple. They had an early mystique for some, which came from the false notion that they were establishing a state. But ISIL brutalized its own people, and what few services they did provide were financed and hundreds more lower-level commanders. Such strikes disrupt the enemy's ability to plan and conduct operations here or conduct external attacks around the world. ISIL's propaganda is becoming less effective. They named their magazine V.A.A. after a town in northern Syria, which they said would be the site of an apocalyptic battle with the West. It used to feature articles about a utopian Islamic state. Now the name of their magazine is V.A.A. because thanks to Turkey and our Syrian partners, V.A.A. is under new management, no longer in ISIL's control. Now V.A.A. prints articles on how to best kill Westerners with knives and large trucks. As the capability of ISIL as an organization is reduced, the capabilities and resources of our partners continue to grow. To date, the coalition has trained over 66,000 Iraqi security forces and over 3,000 Syrian partner forces. These forces have taken the fight to the enemy. They've encircled and are assaulting ISIL in Mosul and are marching to liberate Raqqa as we speak. Regarding Mosul, the Iraqi security forces have seen a remarkable turnaround. Just 2 years ago, they were a defeated and broken army, barely able to stop ISIL at the gates of Baghdad. Today, they're conducting a multiple division combined arms assault on a major city 400 kilometers from their capital. This operation would challenge any army. In Syria, Turkey and their partner forces have made tremendous progress in securing their border, liberating a large number of towns and villages, and they are now driving to eject ISIL from the city of Al-Bab. In August, our Syrian partner force, the Syrian Democratic Forces, liberated tens of thousands of people from ISIL in the strategically important city of Manbij. Last month, they started operations to isolate Raqqa, ISIL's self-proclaimed capital. So far, they have liberated more than 800 square kilometers on their march toward the city. All told, almost 3 million people and more than 44,000 square kilometers of territory had been liberated from ISIL in 2016. The coalition's main effort remains to liberate ISIL's twin capitals of Mosul and Raqqa. The liberation of these cities will largely dismantle ISIL's physical caliphate, which is a necessary step in the group's ultimate demise. We recognize this step, while vital, is not sufficient. There is still a lot of work to be done. It will be important to maintain the focus of our more than 60-nation coalition effort. Our Iraqi and Syrian partners have made tremendous sacrifices to free their land from ISIL. Their efforts to defeat ISIL improve security in all of our nations. We look forward to continued progress in the coming year. In closing, let me say that for more than 2 years now, the soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and civilians of the Counter-ISIL Coalition have supported all of these efforts brilliantly. They have provided training, equipment, intelligence, fire support, and advice from the ministry level in Baghdad all the way down to battalion formations at austere and dangerous forward locations on the dusty battlefields of Iraq and Syria. All Americans and the entire world should be grateful and proud of what their sons and daughters are doing to make our nations and the world safer from this evil scourge. I know I'm grateful and proud to stand in their ranks, especially with the holidays approaching. Thanks. With that, I'll take your questions.
Lita Baldor from the Associated Press.
Hi, General. Thanks for doing this. Good to see you again. I have a couple questions on Syria. First, can you... as you try to rally more of the forces for Raqqa, and can you say how many Arab forces have you been able to gather for the fight to go back into Raqqa?
Okay, thanks, Rita. Just for the technical folks there, the mic is kind of getting overpowered, and it's really loud and hard to understand what the question is. But I think what I heard, she asked me about Aleppo and the withdrawal from there, the wrapping up of Aleppo, and the complications that causes for our campaign. And then I think hold forces for Raqqa is what I heard. So I'm going to answer those, and if that's not the right thing, you can ask me again, Rita. Okay, so I watched the Aleppo on TV. It's horrible, like most of you. And I read intelligence, so I get special access to intelligence about Aleppo, but Aleppo is not in our charter here. So I'm blessed, although it's a curse. The complicator is we have a civil war right next to our war. Even overlapping our war here against ISIL or Daesh. But I'm not responsible for what's going on for the coalition in Aleppo. The coalition's not doing that, so I can't really comment on the withdrawal or the end is near or any of that. You probably know about as much about it as I do. Now, it does complicate our life here. Imagine fighting one war with another war raging just beside and sometimes overlapping our war against ISIL here in northern Syria. So it's certainly a complicator. Then I think you asked a question, I thought I heard something about hold forces for Raqqa. So the Syrian Democratic Forces are marching to isolate Raqqa. Now once they get isolation in position, we'll probably have another pause for a planning event as to how to go about the seizure and liberation of Raqqa. But one thing we're agreed on is that the hold forces will consist of folks from the local area. And that's pretty much been the mode of operation for all of these liberations in Iraq and Syria, is ultimately the security gets turned over to folks from the local area, and governance is returned to them as well. So we're looking for a force from the Raqqa environs, and mostly Arabs, because that is the ethnic composition of Raqqa. So that's what I would anticipate the force will look like once we get down there. Several thousand fighters are marching towards Raqqa right now, many of them from Raqqa or the villages and towns on the way to Raqqa.
We're going to do handheld here to follow up.
Okay. General, one of the questions, I'm sorry you couldn't hear, was Palmyra and what complications that might be posing with the Islamic State taking control of Palmyra again. And I was wondering the number of Arab forces that you've been able to pull together so far, and whether you expect that to grow as you get more U.S. forces in based on what the Secretary announced the other day with the additional 200.
Okay, Rita. That's much clearer, by the way. Whatever you've done to change it, it's better. Palmyra. Yeah. So ISIL has launched a counterattack there and taken Palmyra in the last couple of days. The Russians and the Syrian regime took it from ISIL some months ago. ISIL has retaken it from them. Personally, I think they probably took their eye off the ball in Palmyra because they were so focused on Aleppo, and they didn't properly secure their gains. So ISIL has been looking around the battlefield trying to get some sort of victory to reverse the loss of his narrative across Iraq and Syria. They tried a few spoiling attacks in Iraq and Syria against the coalition forces and our partners. They've been unsuccessful. So I think they saw a weak spot at Palmyra against the Russians and the regime, and they've had a little bit of a victory there. I expect that the Russians and the regime will address it here in short order. It's complicating our life a little bit because ISIL's managed to get their hands on some equipment there. We're watching that, and as soon as we have an opportunity, if the Russians and the strike it, we will.
And next we're going to Phil Stewart from Reuters.
Hi, General. Just to follow up on... Sorry, we missed that last bit. You just, if you could repeat yourself.
I've stopped.
Sorry about that. So just to follow up on Lita's question, you mentioned the equipment that was seized. Could you give us a sense? Are there any man pads? Are there any equipment that was seized that could threaten U.S. aircraft or U.S. operations? And then on the broader issue of Aleppo, there is concern that the defeat of this kind of opposition could wind up being good news for Nusra, good news for ISIL. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, is this going to make your Nusra and ISIL problem worse in Syria? Thanks.
Okay. Your first question, I think, was about equipment seized at Palmyra by ISIL. So I'm not really exactly sure. They didn't send us an inventory of what they've seized there. We believe that it includes some armored vehicles and various guns and other heavy weapons, possibly some air defense equipment. Basically, anything they seize poses a threat to the coalition. But we can manage those threats, and we will. I anticipate that we'll have opportunities to strike that equipment and kill the ISIL that's operating it soon. Then your question about Aleppo and will that free up forces that will further complicate my life? It's really hard to make what we're doing here in Syria any harder than it already is. Probably the conclusion of Aleppo, however it concludes, I would anticipate will be a bit of a complicator for us, but I don't know exactly how. I think most of the actors there in Aleppo probably have other ideas what they're going to do next. But we're certainly looking out for that. Thanks.
Okay, next we'll go to Tara Kopp with Stars and Stripes.
Hi, General. Thank you for doing this. Another one on Palmyra. You just said that if the Russians don't strike it soon, we will. Is there any sort of coordination going on, particularly with the threat of any captured equipment, that the U.S. would act on Palmyra? And then I have one follow-up.
So we don't coordinate our activities as much as deconflict them with the Russians. And so Palmyra is their part of the battle space. But because ISIL may have come into the possession of some significant pieces of weaponry there, we're concerned about it. And I think Russia will probably take action. If they don't, we will do what we need to do to defend ourselves, and we'll coordinate. We'll deconflict those actions with the Russians. I think probably we'll strike it if we see it moving away from Palmyra. I think if it stays, as long as it stays at Palmyra, the Russians will have lead, and the regime will have the lead to deal with that. I think that answers your question. You said you had a follow-up.
3,000, and it seems to be a slightly different number than we had heard in the past of forces of like 5,000. So maybe if you could just clarify that a little for us.
Okay. Well, I can't speak to what number you've heard in the past, but so that number breaks down, and I'm not going to get into details, but it breaks down into two groups. What we refer to as vetted Syrian opposition. Those fighters have largely operated over there south of the Turk border, down through Dabiq, and they have helped the coalition, and to include Turkey, in liberating large areas of northern Syria there that I referred to in my opening statement. The other group that we've trained is the Syrian Arab Coalition, which is an Arab component of the Syrian Democratic Forces. And we've trained both of those. They're distinctly different forces. We've trained both of them.
I'm sorry, you had a follow-up, Charles?
Just one quick one. Thank you so much. Just one last one. With the announcement that 200 additional trainers would be headed to Syria, could you give us a rough estimate of how many trainers are there now? And Lita had asked about this, but will their primary job be to add to that 3,000 number to grow that force?
Okay. So I'm not going to give you specific troop numbers out there, or coalition troop numbers on the battlefield, because that's just information that the enemy's probably watching this press conference, and I don't want him to know. There are several hundred out there, and we're going to add a couple of hundred more. And yeah, they're not just trainers, but they're also supporters of trainers, and they're also advise and assist teams. They run the whole gamut of what we're adding there. And yes, you can certainly bet that they will add to the number of Syrian partner forces that we will train as a primary task for those additional troops.
Next we'll go to Joe.
I guess what I'm trying to communicate to you is that we don't see that those implications are going to significantly impact our campaign that we're doing, because I think the regime and the opposition forces that are fighting their war adjacent to ours will take their fight elsewhere. And again, we think that the impacts on our campaign will be relatively moderate.
Barbara Starr with CNN.
Thank you, General Townsend. Can we go back to some of the comments you made about the progress you're making against ISIS? And can I ask you to unpack that a little bit? Specifically, yesterday, the White House, Brett McGurk said there were 12 to 15,000 ISIS-capable fighters left, the lowest level ever. So can I ask you to kind of walk us through some of where you have come from and the level of progress you made? If there's 12 to 15,000 left, that's against what peak ISIS warfighting force the U.S. coalition was facing, and what kind of capability do you actually think ISIS has right now on the battlefield?
Okay, Barb, thanks. Yeah, so I think Brett McGurk's estimate of 12 to 15,000 fighters is ballpark close enough. We don't track that in painstaking detail because it's kind of hard to define fighter. So you're talking about committed fighters who will die in place, or are we talking about people who are going to start waving a Syrian or a Iraqi flag as soon as the coalition starts approaching? So there's fighters all along that spectrum and supporters. But I think 12 to 15, we got to have a number, so 12 to 15,000 is probably good enough. I don't actually know what the number was. I've heard the peak number. I'm not sure what it was. I've heard figures 30,000, 50,000. I don't know what the peak number was. Again, kind of hard to define that because I'm not sure that people who throw those numbers around are defining them in the same way. I'm not really sure it's all that important what the number was at its peak for us to know that. Suffice it to say this. We've taken back over half of the land that Iraq, for example, lost to ISIL in 2014. So I think that's a measure of the progress. And I could sit here and list city after city, Ramadi, Fallujah, Rutba, Tikrit, Beji, Sharqat, Kiara, and now we're at the gates, banging down the gates of Mosul. So that's an example of the progress that our Iraqi partners have made. What's ISIL still capable of doing? They're still capable of fiercely defending the ground they have taken. We're watching that unfold every day. They're not making anything easy. They're fighting hard to retain the vestiges of their physical caliphate, and I don't think that's going to get any easier. They're also capable of launching dangerous attacks in Iraq and Syria and in this region, as we have seen recently in Palmyra. You were asking, your colleagues there were asking me about Palmyra. We also know that they are plotting attacks on the west, and we know that central to external operations plotting is the city of Raqqa, and that's why we need to get down there and isolate that city as fast as we can. Just in the last week, we conducted a strike. Our Special Operating Forces conducted a strike in Raqqa that killed 3 plotters. 2 of those plotters had direct links to the November 2015 attacks in Paris. So that kind of plotting is going on in Raqqa, and they still have the ability to motivate self-radicalized followers, and they still have the ability to plot and cast into motion attacks on the West. And that's of great concern to us, and we are hammering away at them to prevent that. And we're going to get down to Raqqa and get it isolated and then seize it so they can't plot from there in the future.
Next, we'll go to Kasim Aleri of the Anadolu News Agency.
Hi, General. Thanks for doing this. I will have a couple of questions. It was widely reported in the region that several U.S. helicopters landed in YPG-held Ain al-Arab recently to deliver ammunition and equipment to the group. And social media accounts close to the group also confirm those claims. Could you comment on that?
Okay, I'm not familiar with the reports you're referring to. I'll just tell you this. It's not U.S. policy to provide weapons by helicopter or any other means to the YPG. We do provide equipment, including weapons and training, to the Syrian Arab Corps, or Syrian Arab Coalition, which is a part of the Syrian Democratic Forces.
About Palmyra, you said as the Assad regime and Russians were so focused on Aleppo, they've left a vacuum behind, which led ISIS to take over Palmyra. Do you think that they are further focused on the opposition-held areas, which led to the regime to lose more territory to ISIS?
I'm not sure I followed your question. I know it had to do with Palmyra, and I'll just kind of restate what I said earlier. My own assessment is that clearly the regime and with Russian support were very successful in taking Palmyra back some months ago. It seems like I remember they brought in an orchestra from Moscow or somewhere in Russia to perform a concert there in the ruins of Palmyra to celebrate their victory. I think they failed to consolidate their gains, and they got distracted by the things they were doing, took their eye off the ball there. The enemy sensed weakness and struck and gained a victory that I think will probably be fleeting, but a victory against the regime and the Russians nonetheless.
My question was this. Do you anticipate that as the regime and the Syrian Russians are focused on opposition in the northwestern Syria, they are going to lose more territory to ISIS behind them?
I suppose it's possible, but I don't think it's likely. I think what they'll do is they'll devote. I think this is probably an embarrassment to them, and I think they'll devote adequate attention to holding the ground that they're on. And I don't think. My guess is they probably won't lose much more terrain to ISIL, and that's my guess.
Okay, next we'll go with Tom Bowman from NPR.
General, I want to return to Palmyra. You said that you're basically waiting for the Russians to take on ISIS there, which is unusual because you and your colleagues have said repeatedly that Russia is not going after ISIS. They're going after moderate rebels in the country. So if your job is to basically destroy ISIS, why wouldn't you go after them right now? And also you mentioned that this is Russia's battle space. That's a term we've not heard here yet. Are you basically saying the country is divided, that the coalition has its own battle space and Russia in Syria has its own battle space? And also, if I could quickly turn to Raqqa, you say you've trained 3,000 Syrian Arabs. Give us a ballpark of how many you expect to be able to take Raqqa itself. Is it double that number, triple that number, or even more? And also, Turkey has said it wants to be involved in the final assault on Raqqa. Do you still expect that to happen? There was talk that the Turks wanted their... I'm almost done. That the Turks wanted their own trained rebels to take part in the final assault on Raqqa. If you could address that. That's all.
Okay, Tom, I don't know if you have any follow-ups. I think there were I lost track. I had 4 questions, I think, in rapid-fire succession there. So I'll try to remember. I started writing them down, then I'll try to remember what they all were. You're providing them pretty quick there. So Palmyra. Right. So there's not necessarily battle space. We don't have an agreement with a map, with a boundary. The Russians have this and the coalition has that. There's not such a thing. There are facts of life. There are places where the regime are, and there are places where the Russians are with the regime, usually, and there are places where the coalition and our partners are. These are facts of life. It's not an agreement. It's not a division of labor or the country or anything like that. It's just where people are. So at Palmyra, it's not Russian battle space. I think I use that phrase kind of fairly loosely, but they were there. It was theirs. They were there with their Syrian proxies. Yes, they lost it, and so I think it's up to them probably to take it back. And the reason we're not acting more aggressively is, first of all, that's The first fact of life is that was theirs. The second fact of life is we're not sure who is there on the ground. We can't tell one side from the other. So we can't tell if the truck and the armored vehicle is being operated by a regime trooper, a Russian trooper, or an ISIL fighter. We can't tell that. So we're just kind of staying out of it and watching it right now and protecting our own interest and letting the Russians sort that out, which I think is probably the common sense way to go about Palmyra. Then you asked me some other questions, I think. Yeah, preparing forces for Raqqa. Now, I'm not going to quote specific troop numbers, but I'll just say, yes, probably double or triple the number of forces that we've already trained will need to be trained for Raqqa. It's a big problem. The Syrian Democratic Forces have not faced a challenge this great before. They have pretty high morale. They have a lot of combat capability, but still they're going to need some help preparing for Raqqa. Then, yes, you mentioned Turkey. And Turkey has expressed a desire to participate in the Raqqa operation. We told them a couple of months ago that we need to go to Raqqa now. And they indicated they were not prepared to go right now because of all the other activities that they're doing. And there are some helpful activities, kill and dash. So we told them that we're going to march down and isolate Raqqa, and after we isolate Raqqa, we'll check back in with them and see if there's a way they can be incorporated into the operation before we proceed. So right now we're in the approach march phase to begin the isolation of Raqqa. Follow-up, so I'll write faster this time.
One quick follow-up. What role do you